on diversity, equality, and social work leadership. The webinar is co-hosted by the University of Birmingham in collaboration with the British Association of Social Workers. We also have developing collaborations as a university with McMaster University, where one of our presenters is from. So my name is Mackin Shergill. I'm Head of Department of Social Work and Social Care, and I'll co-chair the event along with my colleague, Professor Robin Miller, who's Director of Global Engagement at the university. Dr. Ruth Allen is the CEO of BASWA, the British Association of Social Workers, and she'll provide some brief reflections after the two presentations have been delivered. And Luke McGorgan is Head of Policy. Dr. Luke McGorgan is Head of Policy and Research at BASWA. He'll kind of monitor the chat box. So if you have particular questions or observations or thoughts that come up, please put them in the chat and we'll kind of draw out the themes, and then we'll have 20 minutes at the end to kind of have an open discussion, and Robin will co-chair that. So we've got two distinguished speakers. Please make sure your mute's on. Thank you. Who are going to present today. Firstly, Dr. Lara Rose, Associate Professor at the School of Social Work at McMaster University, Ontario in Canada. Really glad to have you with us, Tara. Tara's a registered social worker. She also teaches on their Master in Social Work in Critical Leadership and has been part of the faculty since that master's degree was launched in 2016. And Tara's presentation's titled Leadership for Equity, Reimagining Leadership as a Practice of Remembering. So Tara will present first, and then we have Dr. Gurnam Singh, who describes himself as an activist, academic, journalist, and also a registered social worker. Gurnam holds several honorary associate and visiting professorships in the UK, and his presentation is entitled Complexity, Diversity, and Anti-Racist Leadership. So the presentations will run for 15 minutes each. And then, like I said, if you've got particular questions or thoughts or observations, please put those in the post. And I shall ask Tara to start your presentation, please. Thank you.
Just to share my screen, thank you so much. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be here. I have to move my Zoom ribbon so I can see. Super. So thank you very much for the wonderful introduction. I'll just let you know that I practiced for about 15 years before I began teaching, and I've been teaching at McMaster as you said, since 2016, but I have about 20 years of teaching experience in various other universities around in Ontario and in Nova Scotia in Canada. But certainly my work at McMaster in the critical leadership program has been very rewarding. So I want to start with something that may be familiar to some of you, but might be a little bit unfamiliar to some of you, and that is a land acknowledgement. So as part of the process of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples in Canada, we like to give some acknowledgement to the traditional territories that we sit on when we occupy spaces. So McMaster University is located on the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, Mississaugas of the New Credit, Chippewa, Wendat, and Attawana-Daran peoples. It's governed by the dish with one spoon wampum, which is depicted here in a picture. So a wampum belt is a policy document, but it's produced as a piece of clothing that is worn ceremonially. And so on the wampum belt, you'll see the image of a dish with one spoon. And so this wampum tells us that we are in relationship with the community, and that part of our responsibility is to take only what we need from the land, to always leave something for others, and to try to leave the place better than it was when we got there. And so I always think that this is a very apt sort of narrative to begin a conversation about leadership with, taking what you need, leaving things for others, and making things better as you go along. So just to get us started, I'm a little bit nervous, truthfully, but anyway. So I want to talk to you a little bit about sort of the idea of leadership and thinking about social work leadership from a critical perspective. So we know that when we look through the social work literature, I'm sure many of you have done, library search and looked at articles and other resources, and you'll see that there is really a limited supply of social work focused contemporary scholarship on leadership. But there are certainly many pieces of scholarship that say, almost since the beginning of our profession, that we need to really think about leadership and we need to, invest some resources in it. But up until now, we've used really interdisciplinary perspectives on leadership, drawing from other areas. And oftentimes what happens is that the values orientation or the focus on social justice and social change that is an important part of social work gets lost. Many of the models that we may draw from focus on sort of careerist orientations or sort of how to get ahead in management, or they focus on kind of carving up the activities of leadership into things like traits that leaders have or states that leaders occupy, making yourself more calm or making yourself more assertive, or particular skills like organization or change management. And they often reflect capitalist, colonial, and traditional power approaches that critical social work seeks to change. And if we look at some of the very popular people like Brene Brown, we can see these things echo in her work. And oftentimes these perspectives talk about leadership as a formal position. But that's not the only kind of leadership that exists. We have community leaders, we have grassroots leaders, we have leadership that happens in organizations that doesn't necessarily come with a title. And knowing that 83% of all social workers are women, but only between 35 and 54% of management positions are occupied by women, we have to think about what we're tapping into and who we're leaving out when we look at these perspectives. So I guess a question I would raise when we're concerned with equity and diversity and inclusion is how do we access and utilize the knowledge and perspectives and approaches that exist within our profession that we use to make change for other people, that we could use to make change for ourselves and within the organizations that we work. So some of what we need to do is mobilize the knowledge that we have within our profession. And so some of the critical perspectives that allow us to do this is to think about methods like collaborative ethnography. So where we're exploring or investigating the organizations, the spaces, the movements that we function within, and developing an understanding or a story of those places together with other social workers. We can think about critical reflexivity and storytelling. How do we understand who we are in our profession, and who we are in our interactions with the people that we seek to work with? And what stories can we mobilize about these practices that would produce leadership knowledge that we could use? Whoops, I don't know why the computer just moved on when I'm not done. Let me see here. Okay, and then oral history and archival research are two other methods that allow us to look at what's happened and what's happening in social work so that we can mobilize our own leadership knowledge. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about a project that I've been working on for the last couple of years and will continue to work on for a couple more, and that is the Understanding Social Work Leadership in Canada project. So in 1983 and 84, there were a series of oral histories that were completed by a woman named Karen Hill. She did a research project across the country, interviewing social workers who identified as pioneers in the profession, who had practiced between about 1920 and about 1983. So we are going to also produce an additional series of contemporary oral histories, 50 of those across the country. And the reality of social work in the time that Hill did the original project was the vast majority of social workers included were white. And so we have a very multiracial, multi-ethnic country. And so we'll be using an equity reference model to develop the new oral histories. And through these oral histories, we'll be completing a comparative analysis to develop a model for social work research, or for social work leadership, and develop educational resources for teaching social work leadership through this project. So one of the themes that's come up that I think is an important thing to think about as I've been working with this material and recruiting new nominations for social workers is the idea of anamnesis, or the idea of remembering. So some of our contemporary scholarship, like post-structuralism or postmodernism, may suggest that looking at history, is not necessarily an important part of building a future, but I would argue that there are important things that we need to find from history and keep in mind as we move forward. And so we can look at some scholarship that covers a very broad spectrum, from religious studies through to medical studies, that looks at this idea of anamnesis, or the process of trying to remember as a remedy for forgetting. So it's a perspective that looks at people's individual experiences to seek out the universal experiences that exist within those. Not a kind of reification, but an understanding that we can learn from others. It's also a process of thinking about being a part of something that exists beyond the time that we're in, but that we still have to negotiate in the here and now. So if we think about things like racism, sexism, classism, if we think about other forms of oppression, if we think about the social justice mandate of social work, it's something that has existed before us and likely will exist in some forms beyond us, but we can learn from those things and think about the future, but we still have to figure out what to do in the here and now. We also want to think about undoing official stories of history by attending to the stories of ordinary others, and how these people tell their stories, and in our case, their leadership stories, about how they accomplished the things that they did. And then we want to think about how remembering, not the specific remembering, but the remembering of values and beliefs, can reactualize those values and beliefs in a community. So how do we as social workers, in a time when we're really pushed with things like neoliberalism and other kinds of expectations from funders and governments, how do we make sure that we are reactualizing those values around social change and social justice in our work? Okay, so what I wanted to do is share with you a few examples of the kinds of stories that we're drawing on. So Kiyoshi, or Kei Shimizu, was one of the individuals featured in the original oral history stories. And she was the first social worker in Canada to graduate from a university as a Japanese Canadian person. She originally applied to do her studies at the University of British Columbia and was denied admission because she was Japanese Canadian. The school determined that she would not be employable if she got a degree, so there was little point in allowing her into the program. By a very interesting turn of fate, and I would suggest if you're interested, watch the oral history, she bumped into a famous politician who led the Canadian Commonwealth Federation in the 1940s, who said to her, never take no for an answer, and helped her make some linkages with people within the Vancouver community who sent letters to the University of British Columbia talking about the need for Japanese Canadian social workers. So Kay was admitted to the program, and once UBC got on board, they really got on board, because Kay was in the program when Pearl Harbor happened, and she was interned in an internment camp after the Pearl Harbor event, which was something that happened to many Japanese Canadians during that era. And so Kay was able to complete her degree and complete her placement working in the internment camp while she was interned. So she graduated with her MSW on time. She went on to be a leader in the social work profession, particularly around women's services and services to children with disabilities. And she worked tirelessly with other Japanese Canadians and was successful in getting a formal apology from the Canadian government. Kay is still alive. She's a very elderly woman living in a care facility at the present time, but she's certainly someone whose life story and whose experiences could teach us something about how to be a leader today. Similarly, Florence Philpott, well, not similarly, but Florence Philpott is another example of a leader who experienced many obstacles. She wanted to be a veterinarian, but was not allowed to become a veterinarian because she was a woman when she was doing her training. So she settled on teaching, and she went to the University of Illinois, Chicago to do their teaching program. She did a placement at Hull House, which is a very famous settlement house modeled over after the UK's Toynbee Hall. And Florence had lunch with Jane Addams, who was one of the founders of Hull House. And during that lunch, Jane convinced her that forget teaching, become a social worker. She went back to Toronto, did her degree at the University of Toronto, and was the founder of the Canadian Association of Social Workers. And she worked very diligently throughout her life in women's services, but also to create professionalization within social work and to recognize women's role in the profession. I suspect I'm close to time, but all of these social workers have created histories. Anne Dumoulin worked with Indigenous people in the Prairie provinces. Vilma Curl studied in Estonia, moved to the United Kingdom during the war. Her social work credentials were not recognized. She emigrated to Canada and worked to establish the credentialization of internationally educated professionals, a legacy that we still stand very strongly on today. And David Weiss was a social worker who worked in Montreal around issues of anti-Semitism, particularly around the repatriation of deceased members of the Jewish community who were being buried in mass graves, which was an abomination to the religious tradition. But the religious community was unable to mobilize support from local politicians to alleviate the situation. And so Weiss was hired to negotiate this kind of recognition of religious rights in a province where both religion and language are strongly held tenets of identity. And so I include Weiss because Quebec continues to be a province in Canada that has introduced laws that limit people's freedom of expression around religion and have banned the wearing of any religious symbols, including the hijab. So Weiss's legacy of how one negotiates across difference and creates a recognition of rights is something that we could still benefit from today. So I'll just conclude by saying, what is challenging is that social workers and social work, we're not very good at recognizing ourselves and recognizing the legacy that we lead. And so this oral history project preserves and allows us to tap into this knowledge that's held. But even in the time that we've been working on the project, we had 2 nominees. Joan Glode, who is depicted in black and white. She was the first woman Indigenous social worker in Canada to receive a master's degree. She was the first executive director of an Indigenous-led child welfare organization in Canada. And unfortunately, she died just about a month ago, so we will not be able to complete an oral history with her. And so some of her legacy will not be available to us. And on the other side, we have Audrey McLaughlin, and Audrey McLaughlin was a social worker in Nova Scotia who led the New Democratic Party, which is similar to the Labour Party, in Canada for many years, and she also died about 2 months ago. So when we don't collect our own history, when we don't sort of preserve our own legacy, tap into what we know, these things do get lost. And so it's certainly something to think about in terms of our own investments. So if you're interested in the project, we have a website. We also have a YouTube channel where you can go and watch these and 40 some odd other oral histories. They're all stories of leadership, and they're all stories that we can learn from. And so here's some references and photo credits, and I thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much, Tara, and sincere apologies to constrict you in such a short time frame. But absolutely really interesting, and we'll kind of pick up on a number of those issues, and I know people putting into the chat as well. Can I introduce Gernam now to do your presentation, Gernam? Yeah, we can see it. Good. We can't hear you, Gernam. I think you're on mute. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Okay. There you go. Yeah. So.
Right. Okay. So I've only got 15 minutes. So I'm going to go pretty fast through these things, and you've had the introduction, so I won't spend too much time on that. I'm just going to go straight into what I've got to say. So I guess the first thing is, we have to have an argument for equality and diversity and inclusivity and anti-racism. And if we still need to be convinced about these arguments, then we are actually in trouble. But there are at least 4 different arguments why we should be thinking about these questions very seriously. Legally, we're required to do so. There's lots of international and national legislation. We talk about decolonization. The UN, 50 years ago, declared that we need to decolonize the world and we need to decolonize institutions. So these kind of arguments, oh, we need more information. Well, it's a moral responsibility. Professional arguments are there, ethics of care, protection, economic arguments, and I'm going to be touching on those, and also self-interest. I think in critical race theory, one of the strategies is to try and create this self-interest. So, make the argument, equity, diversity, inclusivity for everybody. It's not just some kind of redistribution project. It's actually about all of us, and I'm going to make that argument if I can. But it's a complex challenge. It's not because in a sense, if it was an easy challenge, we would have done it by now. Yeah. And I think the complexity in it, and I'm saying complex both in that it is a complex challenge, but in terms of complexity theory as well, and I'll come back to that. These concepts around diversity and equality have multiple and unstable meanings. So we're not all, as it were, singing from the same hymn sheet. That's one of the complexities. They're often defined in relation to essentialist ideas around human difference. And I talk about that as surface diversity, kind of visual differences. They're politically charged, they're socially constructed. And we know that, if you might have a solution in one organization, it doesn't mean that solution will necessarily be the one in another organization. So it doesn't one side, and being complex challenges does not mean that there are no solutions, but it does mean that we need to be more creative than we are, and we need bespoke solutions, and creativity is really key to, I think, leadership. And one way to do that is to flip the frame. So maybe rather than talking about the problem of diversity, problem of racism, maybe we should talk about the problem of inequity, of non-diversity. If you don't have a diverse organization, then is that okay? Is the problem diversity? It's not, is it? The problem is lack of diversity. So when we think about complexity and diversity, why is it important for inclusion? And in closed systems, and that graphic on the right there shows that diversity actually is a problem. In a closed system, you don't want diversity. You want uniformity. You want predictability, variation around the mean for performance, and so you avoid that. Social work and the work that we do, we're not in closed systems. If we were in closed systems, then fair enough, Actually, where we work in complex systems, that graphic at the bottom tries to depict that. It plays a different role in a complex system. In complex system, diversity is absolutely critical to that system functioning, to that system evolving. It underpins system level robustness, allows for multiple responses to external shocks. It provides the seeds for large events by creating outliers. And it drives novelty and innovation. And this is something from Princeton, their diversity and complexity. What this means is, whether one's talking about organizations or animals and plant species, diversity leads to increased chance of survival and success. And why? Because limited variety leads to diminished chances of coping with variability compared to an organization, and species where there's greater diversity. And I think that we in essence, we're living increasingly complex times. So, to survive, we need to be even more diverse, I would argue. And diversity and complexity is essential to survival. I love this graphic. Ecosystem diversity. We in social work, we used to talk about I don't know what was it? Ecological social work, or we talk about different theories that we would bring together. Eclectic social work. I'd like us to talk about ecosystem diversity based social work. And I love this quote from Michael Palin. I love his travels and things. He says, contrary to what politicians and religious leaders would like us to believe, the world won't be made safer by creating barriers between people. In a sense, by working against diversity, the evil get them out, the infidels must die. It sounds frightening, but they're desperately empty of argument and understanding. They're the rallying cries of prejudice and the calls to arms of those who find it easier to hate than admit they might not be right. Armageddon is not around the corner. This is only what people of violence want us to be. The complexity and diversity of the world is the hope for the future. Okay, in a sense, that's true. You know, an undiverse world is a dead world. An undiverse profession is a dead profession. And I think we need to really kind of see that as the absolute, you know, bottom line. There's lots of evidence within different spheres of life about the absolute relationship between success and survival. Diversity of microorganisms in your gut leads to better health. Diversity in diet molecules, white flour, white sugar, unhealthy. Diversity in dietary species. And actually, if you think about, say, malnutrition, malnutrition is not having food to eat, it's not having enough diverse food to eat, yeah? Diversity of ecosystems, high diversity, a more resilient, productive, carbon absorbent. Diversity of social systems allows institutions to flourish. And diversity of portfolio, better economic returns. Diversity of leadership teams leads to better performance. And this is the kind of McKinsey stuff that gives you lots of empirical evidence about the effectiveness of diverse organizations. And this work isn't just in the kind of private sector, but increasingly the same is applied in public sector work. So what I want us to do is that, in a sense, the problem is that we don't really, we treat diversity as a surface phenomena. And I'd like us to think about deep diversity, yeah? And I'm trying to use this to illustrate, you know, surface diversity is like going to the zoo and thinking that you visited the zoo, you know what giraffes are about. You've experienced diversity of species. But in truth, the only way to really know about giraffes is to be in the savannah, in that space where giraffes live in a natural way, yeah? Then you will realize it's not all that kind of, it's not about taking pictures and, you know, having the kind of fences. So in a sense, we have to go beneath, go deeper. And deep diversity is about going beyond the surface. And in terms of thinking about that in terms of race, so surface diversity, it tends to be about these kind of racist conceptions of human difference, yeah? Around, you know, pyramid of human development, civilization, intelligence, and we know all that. And what I'd like us to think about is diversities and of ecologies of knowledge. And here I think we're thinking about, you know, we're all kind of the same, we're all universally the same, but because of our historical trajectories, because of the environment and the places in which different people have kind of lived and evolved, we can think about broadly, you know, non-native African American knowledge, Asian knowledge, African, European knowledge. And here we situate and that kind of links, I think, with Tara's presentation about, you know, bringing in other ways of looking at the same problem. It's not necessarily a kind of Hegelian dialectic where one is trying to negate the other. And that's the other important thing, is in ecologies of knowledge, we're trying to bring things together. This is something that Macon actually taught me, is what stops us from doing this. And I think what stopped us is because in moving to that space presents almost ontological, almost these existential threats to us. And therefore, we go into this kind of trauma response of fighting or flying, falling or freezing, a sense of helplessness. And we reach for familiar solutions and we never move forward. And I think really what it demands of us is to kind of think completely differently. And that will take some kind of risk. But we can't do this on our own. In some senses, complex problems can only be solved by working together. Yeah. Otherwise, we just reproduce the kind of problems that we have. In fact, I mean, I'm not going to spend any time on this slide, but Eileen Munro, in her review, talked about that. She's talked about how the system can become better at monitoring how it is performing, learning about emerging difficulties and responding creatively and adaptively to tackle them. The aim is a legacy where the system is better equipped to continuously learn and improve. The aim is to make it harder for people to do something wrong and easier for them to do it right. So, you know, and I think the whole kind of thrust of her review was to see social work in its complexity, but that requires novel solutions and creativity. This is a useful slide. Again, time is really kind of running behind me. So this is the work that says, how can you develop leadership based on systems thinking and on complexity? And it talks about vision and leadership. We have the capacity to zoom in and zoom out, see beyond the horizon. Coalitions of change, co-creation is really important here, and bringing in stakeholders. Talks about delivery architecture. To succeed, there needs to be a coherence across systems whilst avoiding top-down approaches. And then it talks about data collection, leadership effectiveness, and evidence-informed policy and learning. So some of this stuff's familiar, but some of it I think is quite challenging. We don't do it well enough. So effective leadership, it's not enough to issue detailed policy programs or grand visions without an infrastructure. So we need to think about the delivery as well as the vision. So if we move, I'm just going to come to some kind of conclusion now because I'm conscious of time. Complexity leadership theory, which is CLT. I've just come across this. It's interesting. It talks about 3 kinds of dimensions that, dynamic interactions. We touched on that earlier on. Complex networks require dynamic interaction, emergent outcomes. That's saying you cannot, as it were, impose an outcome, and you can't develop an outcome through a formula. You have to allow that outcome to emerge. And that's quite challenging because it's almost like letting go, yeah? And distributive leadership, I mean, going away from these top-down models to much more kind of flat, circular models. And that again fits in, I think, with the stuff that's coming out in terms of Indigenous people and the whole idea of circles, particularly from Canada and places like that. So in terms of anti-racist change, this is the last slide, I think, yeah? And this is you can actually go for much more detail from the Wellcome Trust's anti-racist principle guidance toolkit there. The first principle is we need to plan. If it's to stand any chance, anti-racism needs to be embedded in strategic planning. And the other thing is we need to see anti-racism not as a moment, but a movement. Yeah, it's a kind of constant movement. It's an ongoing revolution, if you like. But then we need to investigate properly. What is your starting point? And again, different organizations might have different baseline, but we need to have some kind of baseline data. And then we need to involve, and that's where the complex co-creation comes in. And it's about, and I think that's leadership from above, leadership below, but also leadership from side to side. And it's about then, principle 4 is what's called counteract. And that means the status quo is the problem, but we tend to work to reinforce the status quo. Yeah, so it must be necessarily disruptive, which means confronting resistance. So how do you confront resistance? I think pedagogy is really important here. How we engage with people who might be going through a trauma. And progress, anti-racism is not a moment, but a movement. And ultimately, a key component is progress. But, in a sense, we never get to an end game. And that's it. So I've got to my end game here. Thanks a lot, guys.
Again, apologies, Gunam, for constraining time, but thank you again. Really stimulating, as with Tara's presentation. I mean, there's just so many connections and things buzzing. I think I've just had overload of ideas, really. But I'm going to hand you over to Ruth. Ruth, if you could just perhaps from your perspective, any kind of critical reflection, commentary. You're on mute, Ruth. Yeah.
Thanks so much, and thanks to both speakers. That was absolutely fascinating, and I feel like saying, so we're going to be here for the rest of the week then, picking and unpacking and learning together. So thank you for that richness. I was going to talk about each of them separately, and then just think about some of the links very briefly. Tara, your presentation about how much we need to understand our history and own it and treasure it and critique it, I think was really, really well made. It chimes with work that we've done in the British Association of Social Workers, and also that's being done by the UK Social Work History Network and others. And it just brought home how leadership for now has to be rooted in our understanding of our past, or certainly can grow, has so much potential to grow from what we understand from our past, both people as inspirations for the future, approaches, and also the confidence that I think comes from understanding our own heritage and claiming our own heritage and telling our own story, and how that it feels like that was really a very important reminder how that is a kind of seedbed for developing our own new ideas in leadership now in contemporary context and making that connection. So I just found that really important, fascinating, and it really resonated with work that we've done, and I'm really glad to make this connection here because it's fascinating. And I think the issue about, just to pick up specifically on the fact that social work is indeed in the UK and perhaps elsewhere, 83% social workers in the UK are women. There is a real sense of the gendered history here, as well as, of course, a history that we have to understand through the lenses of all of the diversity of the social workers that have gone before, as well as the social workers now, and how we understand those kinds of knowledges against the taken for granted and conventional knowledge bases and stereotypes, effectively, of what leaders and leadership is. So thank you very much for that. Gurnham, I was really, again, really stimulated by your presentation and for the way in which you have integrated our challenge around anti-racism and that notion of deep diversity, and really thinking about what we mean by diversity and the importance of that within complex systems, and that we can really only survive as, you know, the complex beings that we are, the complex organizations and societies that we are, and the complex planet that we are, if we appreciate ecological and systems understanding of the interconnectivities of everything, but also the necessary richness that comes from what, you know, from diversity within organizations, and for instance within social work, and how what I was taking from it was the message about how as leaders, whatever, we could talk all day about the definition of a leader, but whatever we mean by leadership, it has to be in human systems, it has to, and in all ecological systems, it has to be informed by that sensitivity, that understanding, and that deep understanding of interconnectivities and how diversity is what was the phrase? Complexity and diversity of the world is the hope for the future. So I just picked up on that. Thank you. Also, I think it's important that we had some very practical steps in that last part, which I found very useful, about how we can implement change and how we actually can work collectively as leaders as well as individually to bring about, to continue the struggle of actually making change in anti-racism, which, as we know, is hugely difficult within current societies. So thank you very much indeed, and those are just a few reflections from me.
Thanks very much, Ruth, for those reflections and summary. Luke, there's quite a bit of activity going in the chat. Is there any particular kind of themes emerging that you just want to share with? Again, you're on mute, Luke, sorry.
Two very important questions, Mac, and which is sort of more, shall I say, at the challenging end of the spectrum. So I think we probably let people answer these in the order that they want to. One question is, how did anti-racism and anti-oppressive practice become diversity and equality? Does it mean the same thing? And is social work participating to maintain the current status quo? And is the current social work education encouraging epistemic genocide, especially of knowledge that is non-Eurocentric? So whoever would like to tackle those two.
I'll take the first one because that links directly to my presentation, and then Tara might want to pick this thing about kind of epistemic genocide, yeah? And I'll link that to something that Vijay Patel, I think Vijay made reference to something I said in 1991, 32 years ago. I've even forgotten what I said, Vijay, but anyway, you obviously remembered what I said. I used to be very critical of diversity back in those days, and we were saying, get rid of multiculturalism, get rid of diversity. It's all kind of lip service. We want anti-racism. We want radical social work. And I think that, and the criticism of it was, I've come to realize now, was because we were treating diversity as a surface level phenomena, or diversity was a problem because it was constructing people in terms of these racialized others, okay? And therefore the solution seemed to me, just stop talking about diversity. But I've come to realize in more recent times, particularly in thinking about decolonization, and one of the things that colonialism did was to destroy diversities, destroy ecosystems, destroy species diversity, to destroy people's diversities, to put monoculture in terms of crops, in terms of economics, in terms of people and societies. So that for me, therein lies my reason for reclaiming diversity, but a deep diversity, if you like, a diversity from below the surface, not just looking at the branches of the tree, but looking at the deep root systems and the interconnectedness. Yeah. So that's why I come into diversity. And so diversity doesn't negate anti-oppressive practice or anti-racism. In fact, you cannot do anti-racism without thinking deeply about diversity, because what kind of people do we envisage we want to be? Yeah. So that's my answer to that. There's a lot of work to be done on this. You know, I mean, we talk about intersectionality. That's another way to think about deep diversity. There's Steve Vertevuk's work at Oxford, who talks about super diversity. If we think about, say, minority community in England, if we think about Sikhs, you know, I mean, Mac and I come from a completely different generation. If you go in Southall, they're mostly Afghan Sikhs, have a different cultural, and refugees. So we need to really come back to this concept, but from a different place than we were thinking about it 32 years ago. Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks, Gernam. Tara, did you want to take the second question, or anyone else on the panel?
Sure. So in terms of epistemic genocide, well, it's a concern for sure. I think that, you know, in a Canadian context, there's a lot of resistance to relying entirely on Western thought when we do our work. And so within our accreditation standards, we are required to include Indigenous ways of knowing as part of our curriculum. And increasingly, there is a body of work that's being created, and there's a scholar, Patrina Juhani-Morris, who is at the University of Calgary. She has a book on Afrocentric practice. And so certainly Afrocentrism has also become something that we are teaching in addition to our traditional theories and perspectives. And certainly, you know, from my perspective, when I did my master's degree in the early 2000s and was introduced to Indigenous ways of knowing, it opened up a whole lot of possibilities and a whole language for me in order to be able to talk about the idea that we have to think more holistically about things. And that when we every time we try to solve a problem, you know, there's this great article called Risk is Recursive. When you try to fix something without fixing the entire ecology around it, you create new problems. So trying to really get to the radical or to the root of things, I think is important. And so we're continuing to do this, but certainly, you know, Western thought continues to be dominant within what we're teaching. And I guess I would just say, you know, from my perspective, when I think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, I think of those as sort of markers or destinations. You know, we want to have diversity, we want to have equity, and we want to have people feel included, not just be present, but feel included, feel wanted, feel represented, feel embraced within our organizations and within our functions. And I think of anti-oppressive practice as a theoretical or practice model that concerns itself with, again, a holistic understanding and making connections between experiences of oppression, whereas anti-racism focuses on the issues of race and colorism, which are so dominant within North American society and within Western society. So I guess that would be my answer to the two questions.
Can I just say one thing about anti-oppressive? I have been critical of that in my writing in more recent times. And the reason for that is that I think what that's too abstract. It takes the history and the experience out of people's oppression, because students, particularly on social work, and there's evidence for that, just see it as a formula, as a performance. So the danger with these ideas is they become performative ideas. You have, and actually to some extent, ChatGPT can give you those kind of, you know, you can put into there and it'll tell you how to be anti-oppressive. And then we perform that. So I think that we need to take this struggle back into the lived realities of people, which are realities around culture, but struggling around culture and ideas. I mean, you know, that's kind of what the decolonial project is about. These epistemic kind of genocides is, in a sense, the genocide of people's cultural traditions, but not in this kind of frozen, kind of stereotypical way in which it's represented. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Gernam, and thanks, Tara. Can I just open it up if there's particular direct questions that people want, or points, or anything that they want to share? Robin?
Yeah, no, thanks both for great presentations and excellent response from Ruth. One of the points that Gurnham raised was this idea of the kind of trauma, and the fact that people can feel that they just can't change the status quo because actually it's just too traumatic to think about standing up and kind of making a voice being heard, and perhaps going back to previous times in their life when they faced discrimination. And I suppose I was quite interested in terms of, first of all, Tara, and then Gurnham's response to when you looked at your project, your history project, Tara, you clearly had people there who maybe didn't set out to be leaders and who didn't set out really to try and kind of make big policy and practice changes, but ended up being in situations where their kind of courage and bravery enabled them to do that. Is there any insights you've got to what enabled them to be such impactful leaders and to overcome some of those kind of personal and structural challenges that they had to encounter?
Well, I think one of the things that was clear to me was the idea of support. So some of those leaders, leadership was foisted upon them by their communities. They were tapped by their community to fill a role or to take something on. But even if they were not specifically serving say a community of identity, they had support from other people. So they had mentors, they had sponsors, they had people within the social work profession who wanted to support them and see them come along. And so they were able to draw on those resources in order to move forward.
That's really interesting. So it's kind of that collective responsibility to opening doors for future leaders to have their voice. But that's really interesting. And Gurnham, how would you see it? So is that represented or not represented in social work leadership, education and development? Is that something that you've kind of seen being embedded in how we do that, or again, is that just like a missed opportunity to date?
Well, I'll pick up when you were talking about trauma, because I think that was the kind of the point. Frantz Fanon's work is really important here, because what Frantz Fanon does, he talks about the trauma of coloniality. And he talks about, if coloniality is in a sense creating such unequal power relations that those in power feel that they can do anything to those. And if you think about what's been happening in a lot of our organizations in London Met, in large institutions, and what will happen in residential care was this kind of unequal power relationships relating to all kinds of violences. So there's a connection between trauma and violence. And we might think that our organizations are safe places. They're not safe spaces. They're very violent places, and they're so violent that in fact even people's testimonies, Tara talked about testimonies, are kind of silenced. And it's even worse, we silence ourselves. There's a kind of internalization of the silencing. And I've seen that in social work with Black kind of social workers who have kind of faced all kinds of violences. But I've also seen white colleagues grappling with the trauma of being, as it were, as a colonizer, if you like, in the kind of subaltern relationship. And Fanon talks about that. He talks about the way in which, to invent a new man, and he uses this idea of man, is for us all to deal with the traumas of coloniality. Paul Gilroy talks about melancholy, a post-colonial melancholy. He says, what we do is we go to the edge of the cliff, metaphorically, and we need to jump off to become new, But we kind of then say, that's too risky for me, and we pull back. And that answers the question as to have we made any change in the last 30 odd years? I'd say some incremental change, but we kind of hadn't made, because we keep going to the edge and pulling back. And we all need to jump off the edge. It's a bungee jump. You're not going to die. We need to just go into that space. I don't know. It's kind of like a Vygotskian idea of this kind of this space of what was it called, liminality? This kind of space, the in-between space where we're not really sure about anything any longer, and that is the creative impulse. But how many of us are prepared to do that? How many of us are allowing each other to do that? I don't know. Proximal liminality, I think Vygotsky talks about. Ruth wants to come in.
Thank you. I'm just wanting to just slightly respond to some of the things that are coming in chat and relate it to this discussion. Because I think people in the webinar are highlighting a lot of the real barriers to, whether it's, we call it jumping off a cliff and going through the pain barrier and getting beyond the trauma, or whatever it is that's needed to make real change, or connect with that creative impulse, whether it's to truly inhabit new forms of leadership, or whether we call it truly inhabiting new forms of practice, or whatever, and the connection between the two, whatever. People are talking about how difficult that is in current organizational contexts, because that's not the culture of organizations. Of many organizations, or most organizations, and I'm not saying I think it's impossible for organizations not to. I think organizations can create spaces for this, and that's really the challenge of anybody who's involved in running and leading organizations or groups of people, is to think about, how do you create spaces for even this conversation, and how might that have a positive impact on practice, on the people we work with, on the ethos of our organization and what we do. So I think we have to think about that. But I just wanted to say, what this is evidencing to me is how important it is that anybody whether you're interested in social work as a practice, social work in relation to leadership, whatever part of the field in a way is mostly what you're interested in, having the space to have these kinds of discussions is important, and there's not enough space for it within work contexts, that's for sure. So to have these exploratory discussions and then think about, what does that mean for the struggles that we have with anti-racism in my organisation, or the struggles we have in relation to glass ceilings in where I'm working, or however you want to describe it. So, and I just wanted then to link it to a couple of things about the work of the International Federation of Social Workers. I think it's actually quite important in all of this, because it creates spaces for some of these kinds of really big scale discussions to be had with very different and diverse actors from across the world, actually. So we're hearing about the approaches to leadership and social work practices and policy that are really grassroots, actually. And I think IFSW, with its work with Indigenous countries and peoples, is Indigenous peoples is very important in that. So providing those spaces where we have international collaboration for opportunities, that sort of diversity, and just spaces for us as professionals to talk together, to work these ideas up, is crucial. That is offline from the workplace, that we can then think about how we take it back into organisations that have to deliver, that are working in social work.
Thank you, Ruth. Okay, we've got a few more minutes. Does anybody, again, from the wider audience, want to maybe ask a question or share a thought, or anything that's resonating? Yeah. Luke, have we kind of covered the two main themes that came up in the chat box?
Yeah, it's been quite a lot of comments and reflections, which I think everybody can see. Probably a question which everybody's asking is it going to be possible to circulate the PowerPoint presentations, and when might those come?
Robin, do you want to, in terms of the recording, kind of where we post that, and are we?
Yeah, well, we'll send that round, and we'll post it on the University of Birmingham, and in terms of the BASBA websites, I'm sure McMaster will do. I mean, I'm sure the presenters are very happy to share around the slides, etc. That won't be a problem at all to do that.
Great. Okay, I think we've kind of come to a conclusion. I was going to say an end. I think we're just at the beginning. So thank you, Tara, for your time and contribution. Thank you, Gernam. Also, thanks to Ruth and Luke, and in particular Robin, for kind of heading this up in terms of putting it on the map, really, and having this webinar today. So thanks everybody, and thanks for people kind of participating, and hopefully, you know, there was lots in there, and I'm sure it will kind of resonate after this webinar. But certainly I think we need to kind of continue these discussions, and sometimes difficult discussions, because there is such a need for leadership within the social work profession in terms of our own progression moving forward. So thanks very much, everyone, and have a good evening and a good afternoon, Tara. Bye.